boy running late for class finds a baby locked inside a car. Without hesitation, he rushes the baby to the hospital. Upon arrival, the doctor breaks down in tears when she realizes that Brookfield stirred to life under a sky already blazing with summer heat. The small town seemed to embrace a lazy rhythm, but for Ethan, there was no time to lose. The 16-year-old sprinted down the uneven sidewalks, his backpack swinging wildly behind him as he dodged a trash can and narrowly avoided colliding with a newspaper stand. He was late again. Ethan's mind raced with excuses he could give his history teacher, Mr. Porter. None of them would work, and he knew it. The man was unforgiving when it came to tardiness, and 3 strikes meant an automatic week of detention. His lungs burned, his sneakers pounded the pavement, and beads of sweat rolled down his forehead as he muttered, "One more block. Just one more block." The world around him blurred. Familiar streets, storefronts, and faces turned into a background haze as Ethan focused solely on reaching school. But then, a faint noise cut through his concentration. It was muffled, weak, and out of place against the backdrop of a quiet morning. He stopped abruptly, his shoes skidding on the sidewalk. The sound came again. A cry. Ethan turned toward the nearly empty parking lot of a nearby supermarket. The noise was faint, but it grew louder as he approached an old, sun-beaten sedan parked alone under the relentless sun. He squinted through the glare and froze. Inside the car, on the back seat, was a baby. The child was strapped into a car seat, its tiny face bright red and shiny with sweat, its hands weakly pressed against the window, and its mouth opened and closed in shallow cries. Ethan's stomach churned. "Hey!" he shouted, scanning the lot. "Anyone here? This your car?" His voice echoed, but no one answered. He ran up to the sedan and tried the door handle. It didn't budge. The car was locked. "No, no, no," he muttered, circling the vehicle and trying each door. The baby's cries grew weaker, and Ethan's panic rose with every passing second. The heat emanating from the car was intense. Even standing near it felt unbearable. Ethan could only imagine what it was like inside. The baby's head lolled slightly to the side, and its small chest heaved with shallow breaths. A terrifying thought struck him. This kid might not have much time left. "Hold on, buddy," Ethan said under his breath, his voice shaking as he searched the ground. His eyes landed on a large rock near the curb. He grabbed it without a second thought. "Sorry about this," he whispered, raising the stone above his head. With a decisive swing, he smashed it against the rear window. The glass shattered with a loud crack, scattering shards across the seat and onto the ground. A wave of suffocating heat hit Ethan as he reached through the jagged opening to unlock the door. Pulling it open, he leaned in and carefully unbuckled the child from the car seat. The baby was hot to the touch, its body alarmingly limp. Ethan cradled the child against his chest, his pulse racing. "You're okay," he murmured, though he wasn't sure if he was saying it for the baby or himself. The child's small frame felt impossibly fragile in his arms, and the shallow rise and fall of its chest sent a fresh wave of fear through him. Ethan stepped back from the car, scanning the lot for help. There was no one in sight. The world seemed frozen, silent except for the baby's faint breaths and the pounding of Ethan's own heart. The town clinic was 3 blocks away, a distance that had never felt so daunting. Tightening his hold on the baby, Ethan broke into a run. Every step felt heavier than the last, the heat pressing down on him like a physical weight. His arms ached from holding the baby, but he didn't dare slow down. The child whimpered softly, its cries barely audible now. "Just hang on," Ethan whispered, his voice thick with desperation. The streets of Brookfield blurred past him. The flower shop, the diner, the newsstand he had almost collided with earlier. People turned their heads as he raced by, some calling out, but Ethan didn't stop. His focus was on the clinic, a beacon of hope at the end of the street. The sight of its white facade gave Ethan a surge of energy. He pushed his legs harder, ignoring the burning in his lungs. The clinic's glass doors came into view, but to Ethan, they felt a world away. He tightened his grip on the baby. "Almost there," he muttered, but doubt gnawed at him with every labored breath the child took. Ethan burst into the clinic, his sneakers skidding on the polished floor as the glass doors slammed shut behind him. His voice cracked with panic as he shouted, "Help! Someone help me!" The small waiting room, filled with patients quietly flipping through outdated magazines, turned toward him in startled unison. Behind the reception desk, a nurse froze, her hand mid-air as she reached for a clipboard. Her eyes widened at the sight of Ethan holding the baby, whose flushed face and limp body told a story no words could convey. Ethan stumbled toward the desk, his chest heaving. "I found this baby? Locked in a car. It's not breathing, right? Please," he gasped, his voice raw from running and panic. The nurse's professionalism kicked in like a reflex. "Get Dr. Reeves now," she barked to an aide, who sprinted toward the double doors leading to the emergency rooms. She rounded the desk and approached Ethan, her hands steady but her expression tense. "Give me the baby," she said softly, but firmly. Ethan hesitated for a split second. He had held onto the child so tightly, so protectively, that handing it over felt almost impossible. But as the nurse reached out, her calm authority reassured him. With trembling hands, he passed the baby into her arms. The nurse cradled the baby and hurried through the double doors, leaving Ethan standing in the middle of the waiting room. His knees felt weak, and he leaned against the counter, trying to catch his breath. Around him, murmurs began to ripple through the waiting room. "What happened?" an older woman whispered to a man beside her. A young boy tugged at his mother's sleeve, asking, "Is the baby gonna be okay?" Ethan heard none of it. All he could hear was the echo of the baby's faint cries, or had they stopped altogether? He couldn't be sure. Minutes felt like hours as Ethan stood there, frozen in place. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed faintly, the only sound breaking the suffocating silence in his mind. His hands still tingled where they had cradled the baby, and he found himself staring at them, as if expecting them to tell him whether he had done enough. A gentle voice pulled him back to reality. "Are you okay, son?" Ethan looked up to see a kind-faced woman in scrubs. Her name tag read Margaret, and she carried the air of someone who had seen countless crises but never grew numb to them. I don't know," Ethan stammered. "I found the baby in a car. It was so hot, and His voice broke as he gestured helplessly toward the doors the nurse had disappeared through. Margaret nodded, her expression one of both concern and reassurance. "You did the right thing," she said. "You got the baby here, and that's what matters most. But is it going to be okay?" Ethan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Margaret's face softened, but she didn't give him the answer he so desperately wanted. "We're doing everything we can. The baby's in good hands now." Ethan's legs finally gave out, and he sank into one of the plastic chairs lining the wall. The adrenaline that had propelled him this far drained away, leaving him exhausted and lightheaded. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees and burying his face in his hands. As he sat there, fragments of the past few minutes replayed in his mind. The baby's cries, the oppressive heat inside the car, the feeling of the child's fragile body in his arms. For the first time since it had all started, he let himself feel the full weight of the fear that had gripped him. The sound of hurried footsteps broke through his thoughts. He looked up to see the nurse from earlier returning, her face lined with the kind of exhaustion that came from working under pressure. She walked straight toward him, and Ethan's heart climbed into his throat. "The baby is stable," she said, her voice warm but cautious. "It was close, but you got it here in time. That made all the difference." Ethan exhaled a shaky breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Relief washed over him, but it was quickly replaced by a dozen new questions. "Will the baby be okay now? Do you know who it belongs to?" The nurse held up a hand to stop him gently. "The baby's still weak and needs monitoring, but for now, the immediate danger has passed. The police have been called to investigate. They'll want to talk to you." "The police?" Ethan blinked. He hadn't even thought about that. The urgency of the moment had left no room for anything else. "Yes," the nurse said. "We'll need to find out how this happened and where the baby's parents are." Ethan nodded numbly, the enormity of the situation settling over him. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. He leaned back in the chair, staring up at the ceiling as a flood of emotions coursed through him. Relief, worry, and a lingering sense of helplessness. Somewhere behind those double doors, the baby he had saved was fighting to recover. And for Ethan, the weight of that life in his hands was something he knew he would carry with him forever. The sterile smell of antiseptic hung in the air as Ethan sat in the clinic's waiting room, still reeling from the nurse's words. The police were coming, and his mind raced with what he might need to explain. He replayed every moment since finding the baby in the car. The cries, the unbearable heat, the shattering glass. He stared at his hands again, as if he could still feel the fragile weight of the baby. The double doors leading to the emergency wing swung open, and a woman in a white coat stepped through. Her sharp yet warm eyes immediately landed on Ethan. She was tall, with her gray-streaked hair tied back in a neat bun. Her name tag read Dr. Margaret Reeves. "Are you the young man who brought the baby in?" she asked, her voice calm but firm. Ethan nodded quickly, standing so abruptly that his chair scraped loudly against the tile. "Yes, ma'am. Is the baby okay?" Margaret approached him with measured steps, exuding an aura of quiet authority. "You did well. The baby's temperature was dangerously high, and dehydration had set in. Another 10 minutes, and we might have lost them." Her expression softened as she added, "But you acted quickly. You saved that child's life." Ethan felt a lump rise in his throat. The relief was overwhelming, but her words also left him feeling exposed. He had simply done what he thought anyone would do, yet hearing it framed as heroism made his chest tighten. I didn't know what else to do," he stammered. "I just couldn't leave them there." Margaret's eyes flicked to the faint scratches on his hands, likely from the broken glass. "It takes courage to act in moments like that. Most people would have hesitated. Tell me, how are you holding up?" Ethan opened his mouth to respond, but the words didn't come. How was he holding up? He wasn't sure. The surge of adrenaline had faded, leaving behind a swirling mix of emotions he couldn't untangle. Margaret gestured toward the small break room just off the waiting area. "Come on, let's sit for a moment. You look like you could use some water." Without waiting for a reply, she led the way, and Ethan followed. Inside, the room was quiet and modest. A small table, a few chairs, and a coffee machine humming softly on the counter. Margaret handed him a bottle of water and took a seat across from him. As Ethan drank, she spoke. "The police will want to talk to you soon. Don't worry, they'll just need to know what happened. You'll be helping them piece together the story." Ethan nodded, though the idea of talking to the police made his stomach twist. I don't get it," he said finally. "How could anyone leave a baby like that? It doesn't make sense." Margaret's expression turned grave. "Unfortunately, it happens more often than you'd think. Sometimes it's a mistake, other times it's negligence." Her voice trailed off, her tone heavy with unspoken stories. Ethan's jaw tightened. He couldn't imagine forgetting about a child. The image of the baby, red-faced and gasping for air, was burned into his mind. Margaret seemed to sense his turmoil. "You did everything you could," she said gently. "And because of you, that baby has a chance." Before Ethan could respond, there was a knock at the door. A uniformed police officer stood in the doorway, his notepad already in hand. He had a calm, professional demeanor but carried an air of authority that made Ethan's pulse quicken. "Is this the young man?" the officer asked, glancing at Margaret. She nodded. Ethan was the one who brought the baby in. The officer stepped into the room, his gaze settling on Ethan. "I'm Officer Grayson. I just need to ask you a few questions about what happened." Ethan shifted uncomfortably in his seat but nodded. "Okay." Grayson pulled out a chair and sat down, flipping open his notepad. "Start from the beginning. Where were you, and how did you find the baby?" Ethan recounted the events as clearly as he could. The faint cries, the locked car, the unbearable heat. His voice wavered slightly when he described smashing the window and carrying the baby to the clinic. Grayson listened intently, occasionally jotting down notes. You said there was no one else in the parking lot? The officer asked. Ethan shook his head. No. I looked around, called out, but no one came. Grayson nodded, closing his notepad. Thank you, Ethan. That was brave of you. We'll do our best to find out who the child belongs to and what happened. The officer stood and turned to Margaret. I'll need to see the child's medical report once things settle down. Margaret nodded. Of course. As Grayson left the room, Ethan slumped back in his chair, the weight of the day pressing down on him. Margaret placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. That's the hardest part over. Now you need to breathe. You've done more than enough today. Ethan looked at her, his mind still buzzing with questions. Will the baby really be okay? Margaret smiled softly. With the care they're getting now? Yes, they'll recover. Thanks to you. Her words brought a flicker of relief, but Ethan knew this day would stay with him forever. Every detail, the baby's cries, the heat, the moment he broke the window, was etched into his memory. The sound of footsteps in the hallway broke the quiet. Margaret stood, her expression shifting to one of resolve. Ethan, stay here and rest for a bit. There's more to come, but for now, let yourself breathe. Ethan nodded, though he doubted he could relax. The image of the baby's desperate eyes lingered, a reminder of how close they had come to tragedy. Ethan sat in the small break room, the bottle of water untouched in his hand. Despite Margaret's reassurances, his mind churned with unease. His thoughts kept returning to the baby, its flushed face, shallow breaths, and the terrifying stillness as he had run through the streets. He glanced at the clock on the wall. Time seemed to move sluggishly, every second stretching into an eternity. The murmur of voices from the hallway occasionally broke the silence, reminding him that, just beyond those doors, the world was still spinning. The break room door opened, and Margaret stepped inside. She had traded her calm demeanor for something sterner, her expression shadowed by concern. Behind her, a pair of uniformed officers followed. Officer Grayson and a second, younger officer with a notepad tucked under his arm. Ethan, Margaret said, her voice steady, the officers have a few more questions. This won't take long. Ethan straightened in his seat, his hands tightening around the water bottle. Okay, he said, though his voice was barely audible. Grayson stepped forward, pulling a chair closer to Ethan. His partner remained standing by the door, watching intently. Ethan, I know you've already told me what happened, Grayson began, his tone calm but probing, but I want to revisit the details. Sometimes the smallest things can make a difference. Let's start from the beginning. Ethan took a deep breath and recounted the story again, slower this time. He described the empty parking lot, the muffled cries, the unbearable heat radiating off the car. His voice faltered as he described the baby's weak movements, the sound of the rock breaking the window, and the suffocating heat that had enveloped them both. Did you see anything unusual in the car? Grayson asked. A bag? A wallet? A phone? Anything that might help us identify who left the baby there? Ethan shook his head. No, I didn't look for anything. I just focused on getting the baby out. Grayson nodded, his pen hovering over the notepad. And you didn't see anyone nearby? No one watching or walking away from the car? No one, Ethan said firmly. The parking lot was empty. The younger officer jotted something down on his notepad before Grayson leaned back in his chair. His face softened slightly. Ethan, you did a brave thing today. Smashing that window could have been risky, but you likely saved a life. That's not something we see every day. Ethan shifted uncomfortably. The weight of their praise felt strange, almost unwelcome. I couldn't leave them there, he muttered. Margaret, who had been standing silently near the counter, stepped forward. Officers, she interjected gently, I think that's enough for now. Ethan has been through a lot. Grayson nodded, rising to his feet. Of course. Thank you, Ethan. We'll let you know if we need anything else. As the officers left, Margaret sat across from Ethan, her expression softer now. You're handling this better than most adults would, she said. But it's okay if you're feeling overwhelmed. What you did today, it's a lot to process. Ethan looked down at his hands, still trembling slightly. What happens now? He asked. To the baby, Margaret leaned back in her chair, her gaze steady. The child will stay here until we're sure they've recovered. After that, it'll depend on what the police find. If they locate the parents, they'll have questions to answer. If not, she hesitated. Well, social services might get involved. Social services? Ethan echoed, the words unfamiliar and heavy. Margaret nodded. If the parents can't be found, or if they're deemed unfit, the baby might be placed in foster care. It's not an easy path, but the system is there to make sure children are safe. Ethan's stomach churned at the thought. The idea of the baby, so small and vulnerable, being handed off to strangers made his chest tighten. Do you think the parents forgot? He asked, though the words felt hollow even as he said them. Margaret sighed. It's possible. People make mistakes, even terrible ones. But it's also possible this wasn't an accident. That's what the investigation will determine. Ethan leaned back in his chair, the enormity of it all pressing down on him. He had acted on instinct, but now the weight of what he had stumbled into felt almost unbearable. As if sensing his turmoil, Margaret reached across the table and placed a hand on his. You did the right thing, Ethan. Remember that. Before he could respond, a nurse appeared in the doorway. Dr. Reeves, she said, her voice brisk. The baby's condition has stabilized further. Vitals are improving. Margaret's shoulders relaxed visibly. Thank you, she said, rising from her chair. Ethan watched her go, a flicker of relief warming the cold knot of fear in his chest. The baby was safe for now, but the unanswered questions loomed like storm clouds. As he sat alone in the quiet break room, Ethan felt the weight of the day settle deeper. This wasn't just a moment of heroism. It was the start of something far more complicated, something that would stay with him long after he left the clinic. Hours passed before the police returned to the clinic, their presence stirring whispers among the staff and visitors. Ethan had stayed in the break room, his nerves too frayed to leave. He sat with his head in his hands, the weight of the day pressing heavily on his shoulders. When the door finally opened, it wasn't an officer who entered. It was Dr. Margaret, her expression unreadable. The baby's parents have been found, she said, her tone steady but tinged with something Ethan couldn't quite place. Ethan sat up abruptly. Are they here? What did they say? Margaret took a seat across from him, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The father arrived at the clinic after the police tracked him down through the car's registration. He was distraught, Ethan. He says he thought the mother had taken the baby out of the car when they arrived at the supermarket. Ethan's stomach churned. He forgot? How do you forget your own baby? Margaret sighed deeply. People underestimate how distractions, stress, and routines can lead to catastrophic mistakes. The police are speaking with both parents now, and they'll determine if this was negligence or something more serious. Before Ethan could respond, the door opened again, and Officer Grayson stepped inside. His expression was firm but not unkind. Ethan, the parents would like to speak with you. If you're up for it, I can arrange it. Ethan hesitated, the thought of facing the people who had put the baby in danger filling him with both anger and unease. But after a moment, he nodded. Okay. Grayson led Ethan down the hall to a small consultation room. Inside, a man sat hunched over, his face buried in his hands, while a woman stood by the window, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. The tension in the room was suffocating. The man looked up as Ethan entered. His eyes were red and swollen, his face etched with guilt. You're the boy who saved my child, he said, his voice breaking. Ethan froze, unsure of what to say. The woman turned from the window, her tear-streaked face pale. Thank you, she whispered. I can't even begin to. Her voice cracked, and she buried her face in her hands. The man stood, his movements unsteady. You gave us a second chance. If you hadn't been there, he trailed off, his words faltering under the weight of his emotions. Ethan's anger, which had been simmering beneath the surface, flared. How could you leave a baby in a car? He blurted out, his voice sharper than he intended. Do you even understand how close it was? Your kid almost, He stopped himself, the words too painful to finish. The man flinched, his guilt plain on his face. "I thought my wife had taken him," he said weakly. "I swear, I thought." "You thought wrong," Ethan snapped, his voice trembling. Margaret, who had followed them into the room, stepped forward. "Ethan," she said gently, placing a hand on his shoulder. "I understand your anger, but this family will live with the consequences of this day for the rest of their lives. They've made a terrible mistake, and it's not our place to punish them." The room fell into an uneasy silence. The man sank back into his chair, his shoulders slumped in defeat, while the woman continued to sob softly. Ethan looked at them, his emotions a tangled knot of frustration, pity, and lingering fear for the baby. Margaret turned to the parents. "Your child is stable now," she said softly, "but this incident will have legal and emotional repercussions. The police and social services will be in touch to ensure the safety of your family moving forward." The parents nodded numbly, their gratitude and remorse heavy in the air. As Grayson ushered Ethan out of the room, the man's voice called after him. "Thank you," he said again, his voice breaking. "You'll never know how much it means to us." Ethan didn't reply. He followed Grayson back into the hallway, his steps slow and heavy. The adrenaline that had carried him through the day was long gone, leaving behind only exhaustion and a lingering ache in his chest. Margaret caught up with him as he neared the clinic's entrance. "Ethan," she said, her voice warm and steady, "I know this has been overwhelming, but I want you to understand something. What you did today, the courage, the compassion, it matters, not just for that baby, but for everyone who saw it. You've shown us what it means to act selflessly." Ethan looked down at his shoes, unsure how to respond. Her words felt heavy, almost too much to bear, but deep down he knew they were true. As he stepped outside into the fading afternoon light, Ethan took a deep breath. The air was still warm, but it carried a coolness that hinted at evening. He stared at the horizon, the events of the day playing over and over in his mind. For the first time, he allowed himself a sliver of hope. The baby was safe. The parents had a chance to make things right. And maybe, just maybe, Ethan had found something in himself he hadn't known was there. The days that followed blurred together for Ethan. Life in Brookfield returned to its usual slow rhythm, but for him, nothing felt the same. He returned to school, though his thoughts frequently wandered back to the baby he had saved and the haunting image of its flushed, fragile face. News of Ethan's actions had spread quickly through the small town. His classmates whispered about him in the halls, and neighbors stopped him on the street to offer their congratulations. It was overwhelming, and Ethan found himself avoiding the attention whenever he could. "I didn't do anything special," he would mutter when someone praised him. But deep down, he knew that wasn't entirely true. One afternoon, as he sat in the back row of his history class, his phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a message from Dr. Margaret Reeves. "Ethan, I've been thinking about what happened and how you handled it. Would you like to visit the clinic again? I think you might find it worthwhile." Ethan stared at the message for a long moment, unsure how to respond. He remembered the warmth in Margaret's eyes when she spoke to him, the calm confidence in her voice. There was something reassuring about her presence, something that made him feel grounded in the chaos of that day. He typed back a quick reply, "Sure." When the clinic was quieter than it had been the last time Ethan had visited. Margaret greeted him at the entrance, her white coat crisp and her smile welcoming. "Thank you for coming," she said, leading him through the familiar hallways. "I thought it might help to show you a different side of this place. A side you don't often see unless you're part of it." Margaret led him to a storage room filled with supplies, bandages, gloves, syringes, and neatly labeled boxes of medication. "This is where it all starts," she said, handing Ethan a pair of gloves. "Today, I thought you might help us restock some of the rooms." Ethan hesitated. "I don't know anything about this stuff." "You don't need to," Margaret said with a gentle laugh. "It's just about lending a hand and getting a sense of what goes on behind the scenes." As they worked, Margaret talked about the clinic and the people who came through its doors. She described the long hours, the difficult cases, and the small victories that made it all worthwhile. Ethan listened intently, feeling an unfamiliar sense of awe at her dedication. "What you did for that baby," Margaret said as she stacked a box of gloves, "reminded me why I chose this career in the first place. It's easy to lose sight of the bigger picture when you're buried in paperwork and protocols. But every life we touch, it matters." Ethan didn't know what to say. He thought back to the day at the parking lot, to the fear and urgency that had driven him to act. He hadn't felt brave or heroic. He had just felt desperate to help. When they finished restocking, Margaret led him to one of the clinic's pediatric rooms. A young boy sat on the examination table, swinging his legs nervously. His mother stood nearby, her expression anxious. "This is James," Margaret said, introducing Ethan with a smile. "He's here for a checkup, but he's a little nervous." "Ethan, would you like to keep him company while I get the charts?" Caught off guard, Ethan nodded. Sure." James looked at Ethan with wide eyes. "Are you a doctor?" Ethan chuckled nervously. "Not even close. I'm just here to help out." The boy grinned. "Doctors are scary, but you're not scary." As they talked, Ethan felt a surprising warmth bloom in his chest. He made faces to make James laugh, asked about his favorite video games, and listened as the boy rattled off a story about his dog. By the time Margaret returned, James seemed completely at ease. "You have a way with kids," Margaret remarked after James and his mother had left. Ethan shrugged, though her words lingered in his mind. He hadn't thought of himself as good with kids before, but as he reflected on his brief interaction with James, he realized how much he had enjoyed it. As they walked back toward the main lobby, Margaret stopped and turned to Ethan. "Have you ever thought about what you want to do in the future?" The question caught him off guard. "I don't know," he admitted. "I guess I haven't really thought about it much." Margaret smiled. "That's normal. But after what I've seen from you, your quick thinking, your compassion, I think you have the makings of someone who could make a difference. Maybe not as a doctor, but in your own way." Her words stayed with Ethan as he left the clinic that day. For the first time, he wondered if his future might hold something more than the quiet life he had always envisioned in Brookfield. The idea stirred something deep inside him, a spark of possibility he couldn't ignore. Ethan's visit to the clinic lingered in his mind for days. Margaret's words about making a difference played on repeat, stirring a quiet but persistent question within him. What could I do with my life that really mattered? The following weekend, Margaret invited Ethan back to the clinic, not just as a visitor, but as a helper. She greeted him at the entrance with the same calm warmth, handing him a clipboard and a pair of gloves. "Today, I thought you could help organize some supplies and assist with a few simple tasks," she said. "No pressure, just an inside look at what we do here every day." Ethan followed her through the bright hallways, now feeling more familiar. Nurses bustled past, patients moved between rooms, and the hum of conversation and activity filled the air. There was a sense of purpose here that Ethan couldn't ignore, and it drew him in. Margaret led him to a storage room where shelves were packed with medical supplies. "Let's start here," she said, showing him how to inventory the items. They worked side by side, the quiet task leaving room for conversation. "Have you thought more about what you'd like to do after school?" Margaret asked, her tone casual but curious. Ethan hesitated, his hands hovering over a box of syringes. "Not really," he admitted. I guess I've been thinking about it more since, Margaret smiled. "Since the day you saved that baby?" Ethan nodded, feeling a twinge of embarrassment. "Yeah. I guess it made me realize that maybe I want to do something important. Something that actually helps people." Margaret's expression softened. "That's a powerful realization, Ethan. Not everyone comes to it so early in life." As the day went on, Ethan followed Margaret through the clinic, assisting where he could. He handed out water bottles in the waiting room, watched nurses take vital signs, and even sat in on a routine checkup. Margaret encouraged him to ask questions, and he found himself fascinated by the small but crucial details of medical care. At one point, Margaret handed him a clipboard and said, "Come with me. There's a patient I'd like you to meet." Ethan followed her into a room where a little girl sat on the edge of an examination table, her legs swinging back and forth. She looked up with wide, curious eyes as they entered. "This is Mia," Margaret said, introducing the girl. "She's here for a follow-up after a minor surgery. Ethan, why don't you sit with her while I review her chart?" Ethan hesitated, then took a seat next to Mia. She looked at him with a shy smile. "Are you a doctor?" "Not even close," Ethan said with a laugh. "I'm just here to help out." Mia giggled. "You don't look like a doctor. You look like someone who plays soccer." Ethan grinned. "Well, I do play a little soccer. What about you? Do you like soccer?" As they talked, Ethan noticed how Mia's nervousness seemed to melt away. By the time Margaret returned, the little girl was laughing, her earlier tension completely gone. "You have a gift, Ethan," Margaret said later, as they walked down the hallway. "Connecting with people like that, it's not something you can teach." Ethan didn't know how to respond, but her words planted a seed of hope in him. For the first time, he wondered if there was a place for him in a field like this, somewhere he could use that connection to make a real difference. Before he left the clinic that day, Margaret stopped him near the front desk. "Ethan, have you ever thought about volunteering? We could use someone like you here, even if it's just a few hours during school breaks." The idea took him by surprise. "Volunteering? You mean like helping out around the clinic?" Margaret nodded. "Exactly. You'd get to see more of what we do, and it might help you figure out if this is something you're truly passionate about." Ethan thought about it on the walk home, his mind buzzing with possibilities. Volunteering at the clinic wasn't something he'd ever imagined for himself, but the more he thought about it, the more it felt right. That evening, as he sat at the kitchen table staring at his history homework, Ethan realized something had shifted in him. The idea of his future no longer felt vague or uncertain. For the first time, he could see a path forward, one that might lead him to a life where he could truly make a difference. Ethan's first day as a volunteer at the clinic came faster than he expected. With Margaret's encouragement, he had signed up to help during weekends and school breaks, eager to learn more about the world she had introduced him to. As he walked into the familiar building, wearing a name tag with volunteer printed underneath his name, he felt a nervous flutter in his chest. Margaret greeted him at the entrance, her smile warm and reassuring. "Welcome back, Ethan. Let's get started." The day was a whirlwind. Ethan helped file paperwork, observed a nurse demonstrating how to prepare equipment for sterilization, and assisted with minor organizational tasks. While the work was mundane at times, it was the environment that drew him in, the constant hum of purpose, the shared goal of helping others. Late in the afternoon, Margaret appeared in the hallway and beckoned him over. "There's someone here who would like to see you," she said with a knowing smile. Ethan followed her into a small private room, and there they were, the parents of the baby he had saved weeks ago. They sat together, the father holding the now healthy infant in his arms, while the mother stood, her eyes brimming with emotion. "Ethan," the father began, his voice thick with gratitude, "I don't even know where to start. You saved our child's life. Because of you, we still have a family." The mother stepped forward, holding a small box wrapped in blue paper. "This is for you," she said softly. "It's not much, but we wanted you to have something to remember how much you've done for us." Ethan hesitated before accepting the box, his cheeks flushing. "You don't have to thank me," he said awkwardly. "I just did what anyone would have done." The mother's eyes filled with tears. "That's where you're wrong," she said. "Not everyone would have done what you did. You didn't hesitate. You acted when it mattered most." Ethan opened the box slowly. Inside was a small framed photo of the baby, now smiling and lively. The frame was engraved with a simple message: "You gave us hope. Thank you." For a moment, Ethan couldn't find the words to respond. He looked at the picture, then at the parents, and finally at the baby, who gurgled happily in her father's arms. "I'm just glad she's okay," he said at last, his voice trembling. After the parents left, Ethan sat with Margaret in one of the quieter hallways, the frame still in his hands. "I didn't expect that," he admitted, staring down at the smiling baby in the photo. Margaret leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. "It's moments like these that remind us why we do this work," she said. "It's not always easy, and it's not always rewarding in the way people expect. But when you see the impact you've had on someone's life, it changes everything. Ethan nodded slowly. He thought about the baby's bright eyes, so full of life now compared to that day in the parking lot. The memory still haunted him, but now it felt lighter, softened by the knowledge that his actions had made a difference. As the sun began to set, Ethan helped Margaret close up for the day. On the walk home, he carried the framed photo carefully in his bag, his thoughts drifting between the past and the future. In the days that followed, Ethan continued volunteering at the clinic. He found himself looking forward to each shift, eager to learn more, to do more. Every task, no matter how small, felt like a step towards something greater. The more time he spent there, the more his dreams began to take shape. The idea of becoming a doctor, once a faint spark, was now a clear and steady flame. Ethan began to imagine himself in Margaret's shoes, making decisions, saving lives, offering comfort to those who needed it most. But it wasn't just about saving lives anymore. It was about the connections, the moments of humanity that Margaret had shown him time and again. And for the first time, Ethan saw a future where he could truly belong. The months that followed were a whirlwind for Ethan. Between school, volunteering, and the growing support from Margaret, his days felt fuller than ever before. The clinic had become his second home, and he found himself immersed in the rhythms of its daily operations. At school, his focus sharpened. Classes that once felt tedious now carried a new sense of importance. Science, biology in particular, fascinated him in ways it never had before. Ethan began staying after class to ask his teacher questions, poring over textbooks at night. For the first time, he felt driven not by grades, but by the possibility of something greater, a future he could work toward. Margaret, always attuned to his growth, noticed his increasing curiosity. During one of his shifts, as they sorted through patient files, she said, "You've been different lately, Ethan. More focused." He paused, considering her words. I think I know what I want to do now," he admitted. "I want to help people. Maybe even become a doctor like you." Margaret's smile was proud but measured. "That's a wonderful goal," she said, "but you'll need to work for it. Medical school isn't easy, and neither is the life that comes after. It's a commitment, one that changes everything." "I know," Ethan said, a flicker of determination in his eyes. "But after everything that's happened, I can't imagine doing anything else." Margaret nodded, her voice softening. "Then you have my support, every step of the way." As Ethan's commitment deepened, so did his reputation in Brookfield. His story had become the kind of tale that small towns loved. A local boy who had saved a life and found his calling in the process. One afternoon, while Ethan was restocking supplies at the clinic, a familiar voice called his name. He turned to see the baby's parents standing in the doorway, the mother holding their child, now healthy and glowing with life. "We wanted to check in," the father said, his tone warm. "And to thank you again." Ethan smiled shyly, still unused to their gratitude. "I'm glad she's doing well. She's thriving," the mother said, adjusting the baby in her arms. "And it's because of you. I hope you know that." They chatted for a few minutes, their words brimming with kindness and appreciation. When they left, Margaret appeared at Ethan's side, watching them go. "They'll never forget what you did for them," she said. Ethan shook his head. "I think I'll never forget what they did for me." Margaret raised an eyebrow. "And what's that?" "They gave me a reason," he said simply, "to figure out who I want to be." Ethan's resolve began to ripple outward. His school counselor, hearing of his aspirations, connected him with a local pre-med mentorship program. Margaret, ever the mentor herself, invited him to shadow her during her rounds. Each experience deepened his understanding of what it meant to care for others, both the rewards and the sacrifices. But as his dream became clearer, so did the obstacles. Medical school loomed as a distant, daunting mountain, one that would require years of hard work, money, and resilience. Late one evening, as Ethan flipped through a college guidebook, the weight of it all pressed heavily on him. Margaret's words echoed in his mind. "It's a commitment, one that changes everything." For a brief moment, doubt crept in. Could he really do this? Did he have what it took? But then he thought of the baby, of the parents who had looked at him with such gratitude, of the countless small moments in the clinic where he had felt part of something greater. Ethan closed the book, his mind made up. He might not have all the answers yet, but he knew one thing. This was the path he was meant to take, and he would do whatever it took to walk it. Years passed, each one bringing Ethan closer to the dream he had forged in the small clinic in Brookfield. The road was far from easy. Late nights spent studying, grueling exams, and financial worries tested his resolve. But Ethan never wavered. The memory of the baby he had saved, and the spark it had ignited, kept him moving forward. Margaret remained a steadfast presence in his life. Though she retired from the clinic before Ethan graduated high school, their bond endured. She became a mentor in the truest sense, offering advice, encouragement, and the occasional firm reminder to take care of himself. When Ethan finally earned his acceptance into medical school, Margaret was the first person he called. Her voice over the phone trembled with pride as she said, "I always knew you'd do it, Ethan. The world needs doctors like you." Years later, on the day of Ethan's graduation from medical school, Margaret sat in the audience, her eyes shining with tears. The auditorium was filled with applause as Ethan, now a young man with a quiet confidence, walked across the stage to receive his diploma. After the ceremony, Margaret met him outside, where clusters of graduates and their families gathered to celebrate. She embraced him warmly. "You've come a long way from that day in the parking lot," she said with a smile. Ethan laughed, the memory bittersweet. "It feels like a lifetime ago." "And yet," Margaret said, "it's only the beginning." Ethan returned to Brookfield after completing his residency, his heart set on giving back to the community that had shaped him. With Margaret's guidance, he opened a small clinic in the heart of town. The modest building quickly became a hub for accessible, compassionate care, a place where everyone, regardless of their means, could find help. The clinic was a reflection of everything Ethan had learned from Margaret and his own journey. He treated every patient with the same empathy and urgency he had felt that day when he saved the baby. One sunny afternoon, Ethan stood in his clinic's waiting room, flipping through patient charts. The door opened, and a young woman stepped inside, carrying a toddler on her hip. Ethan looked up and froze. It was the baby he had saved years ago, now a healthy, giggling child with bright eyes and a mischievous smile. The mother smiled warmly at Ethan. "I thought it was time for you to meet her properly," she said. Ethan crouched down to the child's level, his voice soft. "Hey there, do you remember me?" The toddler tilted her head curiously, then reached out with tiny hands to touch his face. Ethan's heart swelled as he laughed. "Guess not," he said, glancing up at her mother. "She knows your name," the mother said. "We've told her the story so many times. You're a part of her life, Ethan." Whether she remembers that day or not, as they talked, Ethan felt the full circle of his journey. That baby had been the catalyst for everything, the moment that turned his life upside down and gave him purpose. One evening, as the clinic settled into its quiet nighttime hum, Ethan stood outside, watching the sunset cast Brookfield in shades of gold and crimson. Margaret stepped out to join him, her hair now silver and her steps slower, but her presence just as steady. "You did it," she said simply. Ethan smiled, the weight of her words sinking in. "I couldn't have done it without you," he replied. Margaret placed a hand on his shoulder. "No, Ethan, you had it in you all along. I just helped you see it." They stood together in silence, watching the day fade into night. For Ethan, it wasn't just the end of a chapter. It was the culmination of a journey that had begun with a single act of courage. Under the same sky where it all started, Ethan felt the promise of what lay ahead. This was his purpose, his life's work, and he was ready to embrace it.
A distracted millionaire lost sight of his daughter. Minutes later, he found her with a beggar and couldn't believe what he was doing to her. The morning sun filtered through the blinds of the luxurious residence in the Upper East Side, one of the most exclusive neighborhoods in New York City. Alexander Rivers, 40 years old, was already awake, with his phone glued to his ear as he paced back and forth in his spacious office. His usually firm and authoritative voice now carried an undertone of barely contained urgency. No, Charles. We needed those permits yesterday. The development in Soho can't be delayed another day, he insisted, rubbing his temple with his free hand. I'll pull whatever strings you need at City Hall, but I want those papers on my desk first thing Monday morning. Alexander hung up the call and exhaled deeply, allowing himself a moment of quiet before the day officially began. His gaze landed on a framed photograph on his desk, a younger version of himself, smiling and embracing a beautiful woman with dark hair and sparkling eyes. Maria, his late wife. 2 years had passed since the accident, but the pain was still as fresh as the first day. A soft knock at the door pulled him out of his thoughts. "Come in," he said, quickly regaining his composure. Mrs. Lewis, the housekeeper who had been with the family for over a decade, poked her head in. "Mr. Rivers, little Sophie is already awake. Should I serve breakfast?" Alexander glanced at his luxury watch and frowned. It was Sunday, the day he had promised to spend with his daughter. "No, thank you, Mrs. Lewis. I'll take care of breakfast today." The surprise on Mrs. Lewis's face was evident, but she simply nodded and closed the door quietly. Alexander made his way to the kitchen, where he found his 5-year-old daughter Sophie sitting at the table, her legs swinging as they barely reached the floor. With her black hair tied into 2 ponytails and wearing princess pajamas, she was the spitting image of Maria. "Good morning, Princess," Alexander greeted, leaning down to kiss the top of her head. Sophie looked up from her coloring book. "Hi, Daddy," she responded with a shy smile, as if unsure how to react to her father's unusual presence at this time. A pang of guilt hit Alexander. When had his presence become something rare for his own daughter? "How about we do something special today?" he suggested, trying to sound enthusiastic. "We could go to Central Park after breakfast." Sophie's eyes lit up. "Really? Can we go to the zoo?" "Of course," Alexander nodded, though internally he was already calculating how much work he could catch up on his tablet while they strolled through the park. After a breakfast of Mickey Mouse-shaped pancakes, courtesy of Mrs. Lewis, who discreetly took over when she saw Alexander struggling with the batter, father and daughter headed to Central Park. The park was bustling with activity on this sunny Sunday. Families strolled down the paths, street vendors hawked their wares, and the aroma of roasted corn and cotton candy filled the air. Alexander felt out of place in his designer shirt and Italian shoes, but Sophie was in her element, her big eyes trying to take in everything at once. "Daddy, look at the balloons," Sophie exclaimed, pointing to a vendor with a massive bundle of colorful balloons. Alexander was about to respond when his phone vibrated in his pocket. Automatically, he pulled it out, frowning at the name on the screen. It was Charles, probably with news about the permits. "Just a minute, sweetie," he murmured distractedly, stepping away to take the call. The conversation dragged on longer than expected. Charles had made some progress with the permits, but new complications had arisen with the investors. Alexander got caught up in the discussion, momentarily forgetting where he was and why. It was the scream of a woman that finally pulled him out of his bubble. "Watch out for the girl!" Alexander spun around, phone still in hand, and his heart stopped. Sophie was no longer by his side. He spun in place, frantically scanning the crowd, but there was no sign of his daughter. "Sophie!" he shouted, panic rising in his chest. "Sophie?" People around him began to notice his distress. Some stopped to ask what was wrong, offering to help search, but Alexander barely heard them. His mind was flooded with terrible images. Sophie lost, scared, or worse. He ran down the path, shouting his daughter's name, his heart pounding in his ears. How could he have been so careless? How could he lose sight of the only thing he had left of Maria, after what felt like an eternity but was only a few minutes? Alexander spotted a familiar figure sitting on a bench near the lake. Relief flooded him for a moment, only to be replaced by a fresh wave of panic. Sophie wasn't alone. Next to her, talking animatedly, was a scruffy-looking man. He wore worn-out clothes and had a disheveled beard. In his hands, he held something Alexander couldn't make out from the distance. Without thinking, Alexander ran toward them, bracing for the worst. But as he got closer, the scene before him began to take shape in an unexpected way. Sophie didn't seem scared or in danger. In fact, she was laughing, her eyes glued to the man's hands. When Alexander finally reached the bench, breathless and with his heart still racing, he realized what was really happening. The man was holding a small wooden figure, skillfully carving it with a pocket knife. Sophie watched the process in fascination. completely unaware of the panic her disappearance had caused. Sophie, Alexander exclaimed, drawing the attention of both. Daddy, Sophie responded with a smile. Look what Mr. John is making. It's magical. The man, John, looked up at Alexander. His eyes, though tired, reflected a calm and kindness that contrasted with his overall appearance. You must be this little one's father, he said softly. She was a bit scared when I found her, so I thought I'd distract her while we waited for you to show up. Alexander was speechless for a moment, his mind struggling to process the situation. The fear and anger he had felt moments ago were now mingling with a confusing sense of gratitude and shame. Thank you, he finally managed to say, taking Sophie's hand. I shouldn't have gotten distracted. I'm so sorry, Sophie. John smiled, finishing the last details of the wooden figure. It was a small hummingbird, carved with surprising detail. No need to apologize, he said, offering the figure to Sophie. Accidents happen. What's important is that she's safe. Sophie took the hummingbird reverently, her eyes sparkling with excitement. Thank you, Mr. John. Still stunned by the events, Alexander pulled out his wallet. Please, let me pay you for your time and for the figure, he insisted, extending a few high-denomination bills. John shook his head as he stood up. That's not necessary, sir. Your daughter's smile is payment enough. With a wave, he began to walk away, disappearing into the crowd before Alexander could insist. Father and daughter stood there, watching the direction John had gone. Alexander looked at Sophie, who gently caressed the wooden hummingbird, and felt a wave of emotions he couldn't name. Let's go home, sweetie, he finally said, gently squeezing his daughter's hand. As they walked toward the park's exit, Alexander couldn't stop thinking about John and his selfless act of kindness. When had he himself last done something without expecting anything in return? When had he stopped seeing the value in the simple things, like a child's smile? The wooden hummingbird in Sophie's hand seemed to weigh much more than its physical grams. It was a tangible reminder that in his pursuit of success and wealth, Alexander had lost sight of the truly important things in life. As they climbed into the car, Alexander made a decision. This couldn't continue. Something had to change. And that change, he realized, had to start with him. Monday morning arrived with the relentless force of routine. Alexander Rivers found himself seated in his office on the 30th floor of a glass and steel tower in Midtown Manhattan, the financial heart of New York City. From his window, he could see Central Park stretching out like a green oasis amidst the concrete and traffic. His mind kept replaying the events of the previous day. The image of Sophie laughing with John, the scruffy but kind artisan, overlapped with the documents on his desk. The permits he had so urgently pressed Charles for now lay forgotten beneath a cup of cold coffee. A soft knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. Come in, he said, straightening up in his Italian leather chair. Valerie, his personal assistant, walked in holding a tablet. Good morning, Mr. Rivers. Here's your agenda for today. You have a meeting with the Soho project investors in an hour, lunch with the city planning commissioner, and in the afternoon. Alexander interrupted her with a wave of his hand. Valerie, can you do me a favor? Look into any support programs for local artisans, especially those affected by natural disasters. Valerie blinked in surprise. In the 5 years she had worked for Alexander, she had never heard him express interest in something like that. Of course, Mr. Rivers. Any particular reason? Just curiosity, Alexander replied, avoiding further explanation. Oh, and one more thing. I want you to block off an hour every afternoon this week. Label it important meeting, but really, I'm leaving early to spend time with Sophie. The surprise on Valerie's face deepened, but she maintained her professional composure. As you wish, Mr. Rivers. Anything else? Alexander shook his head and Valerie left the office, leaving him alone with his thoughts once again. As the day progressed, Alexander found himself distracted in his meetings. During lunch with the city planning commissioner, a pompous man named Roberts, he caught himself asking about policies supporting artisan communities. Well, Rivers, Roberts replied, dabbing his mouth with a linen napkin. Honestly, that's not a priority for the city. Artisans are part of the city's charm. Sure, but the future lies in modern urban development. Like your Soho project, that's real progress. Alexander nodded absently, feeling an unease he couldn't quite explain. How many times had he expressed similar sentiments himself? That afternoon, true to his word, Alexander left the office at 4 p.m. When he arrived home, he found Sophie in the garden, playing with the wooden hummingbird John had given her. "Daddy!" she exclaimed upon seeing him, running to give him a hug. "You're home early." Alexander scooped her up, feeling the day's stress melt away. "Oh, that's right, princess. How about we go get some ice cream?" Sophie's eyes lit up. "Can we go to Roxy's ice cream parlor? They have the best chocolate ice cream in the world." Alexander laughed. "The best in the world? We'll have to see about that." As they walked down the neighborhood streets toward the ice cream shop, Sophie chattered happily about her day at school. Alexander listened attentively, marveling at how much she had grown without him truly noticing. At the shop, a small family-owned place that had been around for decades, Sophie ordered chocolate ice cream with sprinkles. Alexander opted for vanilla, remembering it had been Maria's favorite. "Mommy always ordered vanilla," Sophie said suddenly, as if reading his thoughts. Alexander felt a lump form in his throat. "That's right, sweetheart. Do you remember her?" Sophie nodded, licking her ice cream thoughtfully. "Sometimes, I remember her laugh, and how she used to sing when she cooked." Alexander closed his eyes for a moment, letting the memories flood in. Maria in the kitchen, making breakfast while singing rancheras at the top of her lungs. Maria laughing as they painted Sophie's room. Maria gently scolding him for working too much. "Your mommy was an incredible woman," he said finally, opening his eyes to look at his daughter. "And you're so much like her." Sophie smiled, a smile that was an exact echo of Maria's. "Really, mister?" John said I reminded him of someone too. Alexander tensed slightly at the mention of John's name. "Oh, really? What else did Mr. John say?" "He told me he used to live in a town far away and made big wooden sculptures. But then there was an earthquake and he lost his workshop. Now he makes smaller ones because they're easier to carry." The story resonated with Alexander. He remembered the news of the earthquake in a rural town years ago. At the time, he had barely paid attention, too absorbed in a major real estate project. "Does he ever miss making the big sculptures?" Alexander asked, genuinely curious. Sophie shrugged. He said that sometimes the small things are the most important, like the hummingbird he gave me. He said hummingbirds are small but very brave. As they finished their ice cream, Alexander reflected on John's words. When had he stopped valuing the small things? When had the next big project become more important than moments like these with his daughter? Back home, as he tucked Sophie into bed, she asked him a question that caught him off guard. "Daddy, can we go back to the park next Sunday? I want to thank Mr. John for the hummingbird." Alexander hesitated for a moment. His business instincts told him it was a bad idea to seek out a stranger in the park. But something else, something that sounded suspiciously like Maria's voice, told him this was an important opportunity. "Of course, sweetheart," he finally replied. "Next Sunday we'll go to the park." The rest of the week passed in a strange balance between Alexander's usual routine and his newfound attempts to reconnect with Sophie. Every afternoon, he left the office early to spend time with her. They played board games, watched princess movies which Alexander found surprisingly entertaining, and even tried baking cookies, a delicious disaster in the kitchen. At work, Alexander found himself increasingly distracted. The financial reports and architectural plans that had once excited him now seemed cold and distant. Instead, he found himself reading through the reports Valerie had prepared on artisan support programs. By Friday afternoon, as he was reviewing some contracts, Charles barged into his office without knocking, as was his habit. "Alex, we've got a problem with the Soho project," he said bluntly. "The neighborhood is organizing protests. They say the development is going to destroy a green space and displace several families." In the past, Alexander would have reacted with irritation, seeing this as just another obstacle to overcome. But today, he found himself thinking about John, about the families who had lost their homes in the earthquake, about the small things that sometimes matter the most. "What do you propose?" he asked Charles, his voice calm. Charles seemed surprised by the lack of reaction. "Well, we could apply pressure through our contacts at City Hall, or maybe offer compensation to the most vocal protesters." Alexander shook his head. "No, I want you to revisit the project. Let's see if we can modify it to preserve the green space and integrate the existing community. Maybe a mixed-use development with room for local businesses. Charles stared at him as if he had grown a second head. But Alex, that would significantly reduce our profit margins. The investors won't be happy. Let me worry about the investors, Alexander said, surprising even himself with his decision. Sometimes the small things are the most important. That night, as Alexander sat down to dinner with Sophie, he found himself thinking about Maria. What would she think of the man he had become? Would she be proud of the empire he had built or disappointed by the personal cost it had taken? "Daddy, are you sad?" Sophie suddenly asked, pulling him out of his thoughts. Alexander looked at her, surprised by her perceptiveness. "No, honey. I was just thinking, about what? About your mom. About you. About how things have changed." Sophie looked at him with her big brown eyes. So much like Maria's. "I think about Mommy sometimes too. But then I remember she always said to smile. Even when we're sad." Alexander felt a lump rise in his throat. It was true, Maria had always been a beacon of optimism, even in the hardest times. When had he lost that ability? "Your mom was very wise," he said finally, forcing a smile. "And you're just as wise as she was." That night, after tucking Sophie into bed, Alexander found himself in his study, flipping through old photo albums, images of a life that now seemed to belong to someone else. Alexander and Maria, young and laughing on the beach, their wedding in a small church. The day Sophie was born, with Maria radiant, holding their baby, and Alexander by her side, a mixture of pride and fear on his face. One particular photo caught his attention. It showed Maria sitting on a bench in Central Park, pregnant with Sophie, smiling while holding a small wooden figure. Alexander remembered that day. They had been walking in the park when they came across a vendor selling handmade wooden sculptures. Maria had fallen in love with a small Quetzal figure, and Alexander had bought it for her, happy to see her so delighted by something so simple. The coincidence hit him like a wave. Could John be the same artisan from all those years ago, or was his mind just playing tricks on him, looking for connections where none existed? Alexander stayed up late that night, his mind swirling with memories, doubts, and possibilities. When he finally went to bed, he did so with a renewed determination. Whoever John was, and whatever reasons fate had for bringing him into their lives, Alexander was resolved to make the most of this opportunity to reconnect with what truly mattered in life. Sunday couldn't come soon enough. Sunday dawned with a clear sky over New York City, as if the universe itself wanted to ease Alexander and Sophie's plans. As they prepared to leave, Alexander couldn't help feeling a mix of anticipation and nervousness. Would they really find John again? And if they did, what was he hoping to achieve? "Are you ready, Daddy?" Sophie asked, interrupting his thoughts. She stood at the door, clutching the small wooden hummingbird as if it were a lucky charm. Alexander smiled, touched by his daughter's enthusiasm. "Ready, Princess. Let's go find your friend John." Central Park was buzzing with activity, even more so than the previous Sunday. Families were out enjoying the sunny day, picnicking, walking, or visiting the zoo. Alexander and Sophie wandered through the paths, keeping an eye out for any sign of John or other artisans. After almost an hour of searching with no luck, Sophie started to look tired. "Daddy, what if Mr. John didn't come to the park today?" Alexander was about to suggest they take a break when a familiar sound caught his attention, the soft scrape of a knife against wood. Following the sound, they finally spotted him. John was sitting on the same bench where they had found him last week, working on a new carving. "Mr. John!" Sophie shouted, running toward him with the hummingbird in hand. John looked up, his tired face breaking into a smile as he recognized the little girl. "Hello there, little one. What a surprise to see you again." Alexander approached more slowly, observing the interaction. John was dressed in the same worn clothes as before, but there was something about his posture, the way he held his knife in the wood, that spoke of dignity and pride in his work. "Mr. John," Alexander said, extending his hand, "I wanted to thank you personally for helping my daughter last week." John shook his hand firmly. "There's no need to thank me, sir. Anyone would have done the same." Alexander wasn't so sure about that, but he decided not to argue. Instead, he sat down on the bench next to John while Sophie settled on the ground in front of them, fascinated by the new carving the artisan was working on. "May I ask you something, John?" Alexander said after a moment of silence. John nodded, continuing to work on his carving. "How long have you been coming to this park to sell your figures?" John thought for a moment. "About 2 years, give or take. Since I lost my workshop in the earthquake." Alexander's heart sped up. "And before that? Did you ever work here in the park?" John looked at him curiously. "Well, yes, many years ago I used to come on weekends. I was younger then, and my sculptures were much bigger." "Why do you ask?" With trembling hands, Alexander pulled out his phone and searched for the photo he had found the night before. He showed it to John. Maria, pregnant, sitting on a bench in Central Park, smiling with the small wooden quetzal in her hands. John's eyes widened in surprise. "My goodness," he murmured. "I remember that day. That young woman was so happy with the quetzal. Wait, is that you in the picture?" Alexander nodded, feeling a lump in his throat. "That's Maria, my wife. She was pregnant with Sophie." John looked at Sophie, still engrossed in watching him carve, unaware of the adults' conversation. "The world is small," he said softly. "How is your wife? She must be so proud to see how her daughter has grown." Alexander's silence was enough of an answer. John's expression softened with understanding. "I'm so sorry," he said quietly. Alexander cleared his throat, struggling to keep his emotions in check. "John, I'd like to help you. I know you lost your workshop in the earthquake. Maybe I could—" John raised a hand, gently cutting him off. "I appreciate the offer, sir, but I don't need charity. I've learned to live with what I have." "It's not charity," Alexander insisted. "It's an investment in art, in culture. We could set up a workshop, maybe even a school for young artisans." John looked at him with a mix of amusement and skepticism. "And why would a businessman like you want to do that?" The question hit Alexander like a punch to the gut. Why indeed? Was it just guilt? An attempt to make up for years of neglecting the small things in life? Before he could answer, his phone rang. It was Charles. Alexander hesitated for a moment before answering. "Alex, we've got a problem." Charles's voice was tense. "The investors heard about the changes you proposed for the Soho project. They're furious. They're threatening to pull out if we don't go back to the original plan." Alexander closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the world pressing down on him. "I understand, Charles. Let me handle it." He hung up and looked at John, who was watching him with curiosity and concern. "Work trouble, I suppose," the artisan said. Alexander nodded. John, I need to ask you a favor. Could you watch Sophie for a few minutes? I need to make an important call." John agreed, and Alexander stepped away a few paces, dialing the number for Roberts, the city planning commissioner. "Rivers, and what a surprise." Roberts's voice was jovial. "How can I help you on this fine Sunday?" "Roberts, I need your support," Alexander said, getting straight to the point. "I want to modify the Soho project to include green spaces and spaces for local businesses. The investors are resisting." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "Alex," Roberts finally said, his tone now serious, "you know I've always supported you. But what you're asking is complicated. There are a lot of interests at stake." "I know," Alexander replied. "But it's the right thing to do. Think of the positive impact it would have on the community. It could even be a model for future developments in the city." Roberts sighed. "Look, I can't promise anything, but I'll see what I can do. I have to warn you, though, this could have consequences, not just for the project, but for your reputation in the business world." "I'm willing to take that risk," Alexander said, with a determination that surprised even himself. After hanging up, Alexander stood in the park for a moment, lost in thought. Was he doing the right thing? Or was he risking everything he had built for a whim? When he returned to the bench, he found Sophie laughing as John showed her how to carve a small flower out of wood. The scene hit him with sudden clarity. This was what mattered. These moments, these connections. "John Rackrey," Alexander said, sitting back down, "I want to tell you about the project I'm working on." For the next hour, Alexander told John about the Soho development, about the changes he wanted to make, and the resistance he was facing. John listened carefully, occasionally asking insightful questions. "Mr. Rivers, John finally said. "I understand why you want to help me, and I appreciate it. But I think your project is much more important than an old artisan like me. If you succeed, you'll help a lot more people." Alexander was speechless for a moment. "But what about your workshop? Your art?" John smiled, the wrinkles around his eyes deepening. "My workshop is here," he said, gesturing to the park around them. "Wait, and my art? Well, my art lives on in every person who takes one of my carvings and treasures it. Like your daughter with her hummingbird." Sophie, who had been listening to the conversation without fully understanding, proudly held up her hummingbird. "It's my treasure," she exclaimed. John laughed. "See? That's more valuable than any workshop." Alexander felt something loosen in his chest, a tension he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. "John, would you allow me to buy some of your figures? For my office? And maybe you could come by from time to time to teach Sophie how to carve?" Sophie's eyes lit up at the suggestion. John seemed to consider it for a moment before nodding. "It would be an honor, Mr. Rivers." As they walked home that afternoon, Sophie chattered excitedly about the carving lessons she would have, proudly holding the small wooden flower she had made under John's guidance. Alexander listened, his mind split between his daughter's joy and the uncertainty of the challenges that awaited him. The next day, Alexander arrived at his office earlier than usual. He found Valerie already at her desk, looking worried. "Mr. Rivers," she said as soon as she saw him. "The investors have been calling all morning. They're very upset. And there are reporters asking about rumors of changes to the Soho project." Alexander nodded, feeling the weight of the decision he had made. "Thank you, Valerie. Please schedule a press conference for this afternoon. And call Charles, I need to speak with him urgently." The next few hours were a whirlwind of tense meetings and heated phone calls. The investors threatened legal action, the contractors expressed concerns about the changes, and competitors began circulating rumors about the financial stability of Alexander's company. By mid-afternoon, exhausted but resolute, Alexander stood before a group of reporters in his company's conference room. "Good afternoon," he began, his voice steady despite the knot in his stomach. "I'm here today to announce significant changes to our Soho development project." For the next 20 minutes, Alexander explained his vision of a development that respected the environment and the local community. He spoke of green spaces, of areas for local businesses, of a project that wouldn't just generate profits but would also improve the quality of life for the residents. "I know these changes won't be easy," he concluded. "I know there will be challenges and obstacles, but I firmly believe it's the right thing to do, not just for Soho, but for the future of our city." The reporters' questions were aggressive, questioning the financial viability of the project and the motivations behind this sudden change of heart. Alexander answered calmly, without revealing the personal events that had led to this decision. When he finally returned to his office, he felt drained but strangely at peace. On his desk, he found the small wooden figures he had bought from John the day before: a quetzal, a hummingbird, and a flower. He carefully arranged them next to the photo of Maria and Sophie. His phone rang. It was Roberts. "Rivers?" The commissioner's voice was a mix of admiration and concern. "I just saw your press conference. It was impressive, but you've stirred up a storm. There are a lot of powerful people who aren't happy about these changes." "I know, Roberts," Alexander replied, "but it's a risk I'm willing to take." "Well, you have my support," Roberts said after a pause. "It won't be easy, but I think we can make this work. It could be a model for future developments in the city." After hanging up, Alexander stood at his window, looking out at Central Park in the distance. He thought of John, of his calloused hands working the wood with patience and love. He thought of Maria, of her laughter and her ability to find joy in simple things. And he thought of Sophie, of the way her eyes lit up when she learned something new. His phone rang again. This time it was Charles. "Alex," his friend and business partner sounded exhausted. "The main investors want an emergency meeting tomorrow morning." "Things don't look good, buddy." Alexander sighed. "I understand, Charles. I'll be there." "Alex," Charles continued, his voice filled with concern. "Are you sure about this? We've worked so hard to get where we are. This project could sink us if it goes wrong." Alexander glanced at the wooden figures on his desk. symbols of a world he was just beginning to rediscover. And I know, Charles, but sometimes you have to risk everything for what truly matters. The following months were a whirlwind of activity for Alexander Rivers. The Soho project, now rebranded as Harmony District, became the center of attention in both the real estate industry and the media in New York City. Every day brought new challenges, negotiations with contractors bewildered by the sudden change in plans, meetings with skeptical community leaders, and late nights spent reviewing budgets to ensure the project remained financially viable without compromising his vision. But amid the chaos, Alexander found a new sense of balance and purpose. Every Sunday, without fail, he took Sophie to Central Park for her carving lessons with John. And every Sunday, as he watched his daughter learn the delicate art of bringing wood to life, he felt that he was rediscovering a part of himself he had long forgotten. One Sunday afternoon, as John was teaching Sophie how to carve the feathers of a quetzal, Alexander received a call from Charles. "Alex, we've got problems." His partner's voice was tense. "The project costs are spiraling out of control. The investors are getting nervous. We need to make some tough decisions." Alexander looked at Sophie, her tongue poking out in concentration as she worked on her carving. He thought about the families who would benefit from the project, the artisans who would have a space to showcase their work, the park that would be preserved. "I understand, Charles," he finally replied. "But we're not compromising our vision. Find a way to make it work." After hanging up, Alexander walked over to John, who was watching Sophie's progress with a proud smile. "John," Alexander said, "I need your advice again." The artisan looked at him with curiosity. "What's the problem, Mr. Rivers?" Alexander explained the situation with the project, the financial challenges and the pressure to make compromises. John listened intently, his hands moving automatically as he worked on a new carving. When Alexander finished, John showed him the figure he had been carving, a tree with deep roots and branches stretching toward the sky. "Do you see this tree, Mr. Rivers?" John asked. "And its roots are strong but flexible. They adapt to the ground without losing their essence. Its branches reach for the sun but also provide shade and shelter. That's how your project should be." Alexander studied the carving, reflecting on John's words. "You're saying we should be flexible but without losing sight of our goal?" John nodded. "Exactly. Maybe there are ways to reduce costs without sacrificing the heart of the project. Perhaps some of the local artisans can contribute their work, creating unique spaces that will attract more people. Or maybe you can use sustainable materials that, although more expensive at first, will save money in the long run." That night, inspired by John's wisdom, Alexander called an emergency meeting with his team. For hours, they brainstormed new ideas and approaches, looking for creative ways to maintain the integrity of the project while adjusting to financial realities. As the weeks went by, the Harmony District began to take shape. What had initially been met with skepticism was now gaining the community's support. The media praised the project as a model of sustainable and socially responsible urban development. One day, while Alexander was overseeing the construction progress, he ran into Roberts, the city planning commissioner. "Rivers," Roberts greeted him with a smile. "I have to admit I was wrong about this project. What you're doing here, it's impressive." Alexander smiled, remembering their conversation months ago. "Thanks, Roberts. It hasn't been easy, but I think we're creating something special here." Roberts nodded, looking around the site. "You know, we're considering implementing some of your ideas in future urban development projects. Your approach could change the way we build in this city." Those words echoed in Alexander's mind for days. The idea that his project could have an impact beyond Soho, that it could influence the future of the city, filled him with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. As the project progressed, Alexander noticed changes not just in his surroundings but within himself. He no longer lived for closing deals or quarterly profits. He found satisfaction in small victories. A preserved green space, a community center created, a local artisan finding a new home for their workshop. And most importantly, his relationship with Sophie blossomed. The carving lessons with John had become a sacred ritual for both of them, a time to connect and grow together. Alexander discovered that he had a surprising talent for carving, and soon he and Sophie were competing to see who could create the most beautiful figure. One evening, as they worked together in the studio Alexander had set up at home, Sophie paused in her carving and looked at her father with a serious expression. "Daddy," she said, "do you think Mommy would be proud of us?" Alexander felt a lump rise in his throat. He looked at the photo of Maria, which now held a place of honor next to their carving tools, and then at his daughter, who had grown so much in the past few months. "I'm sure of it, Princess," he replied, pulling Sophie into a hug. "I'm sure of it." That night, after tucking Sophie into bed, Alexander stayed up reflecting on the path he had traveled. He thought about the man he used to be, obsessed with success and profit, and the man he was becoming. He thought about John, with his simple but profound wisdom, and how a chance encounter in the park had changed the course of his life. As he looked out the window at the city lights, Alexander realized he had found something that money couldn't buy: inner peace and a sense of purpose. The road ahead was still long and full of challenges, but for the first time in years, he felt truly alive, truly himself. With a smile, Alexander picked up a piece of wood and began to carve. He didn't know exactly what he was creating, but he knew that, like his life, it would take shape with patience, love, and dedication. The morning sun bathed New York City in a golden glow as Alexander Rivers adjusted his tie in front of the mirror. Today was the official opening of Harmony District, the project that had transformed not just Soho, but also Alexander's own life. "Are you nervous, Daddy?" Sophie, now 8 years old, asked from the doorway. She wore a beautiful blue dress and held a small wooden box she had carved herself. Alexander smiled and knelt down to her level. "A little, Princess, but I'm also excited. How about you? Ready for your big moment?" Sophie nodded with determination. "Mr. John says I'm ready. We practiced a lot." Alexander's heart swelled with pride. Over the 3 years since the project had begun, Sophie had blossomed, not only as a talented carver but also as a thoughtful, compassionate girl who cared deeply about her community. Together, father and daughter headed to the grand opening. The Harmony District was an impressive sight. Modern buildings, designed to blend harmoniously with the preserved green spaces, stood alongside vibrant artisan workshops and galleries. As guests began arriving, city officials, investors, community members, and journalists, Alexander felt a mixture of pride and humility. This project was more than just his achievement. It was the result of a community's effort and vision. Among the crowd, Alexander spotted John, dressed in a crisp white shirt for the occasion. The old artisan, who now led the training program for young carvers in Harmony District, gave Alexander a nod of approval and a warm smile. When it was time for his speech, Alexander took the stage with Sophie by his side. He looked out at the crowd, and for a moment, the weight of the moment hit him. "3 years ago," he began, "I thought I knew everything about success and progress. I believed they were measured in square feet built and quarterly profits. But a series of unexpected encounters taught me an invaluable lesson. Real progress is measured in lives improved, communities strengthened, and traditions preserved." He paused, looking over at John in the crowd. "I learned that sometimes the most important lessons come from the most unexpected places. That wisdom isn't always found in boardrooms but on park benches, in the hands of an artisan, or in the laughter of a child." Alexander continued, explaining how Harmony District wasn't just a real estate project but an experiment in community building. He spoke about the green spaces they had preserved, the workshops for local artisans, and the affordable housing they had integrated into the development. "But perhaps the achievement I'm most proud of," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "is the program we've established for young artisans. And to tell you more about that, I'd like to introduce someone very special." With that, Alexander stepped back, and Sophie stepped forward to the microphone. There were murmurs of surprise and smiles of affection from the crowd. "Hello," Sophie began, her voice clear and confident. "My name is Sophie Rivers, and I'm 8 years old. 3 years ago, I met a man named Mr. John in the park. He taught me that with patience and love, you can make something beautiful out of a simple piece of wood. He showed me that our hands can make magic." Sophie opened the small wooden box she had been holding and pulled out a beautifully carved figure, a tree, much like the one John had carved for her. But this tree had small houses nestled in its branches and figures of people gathered around its roots. "This tree represents our Harmony District," Sophie explained. The roots are our history and traditions. The trunk is us and growing together. And the branches are our dreams, reaching toward the future. The houses and the people remind us that we're all part of this community. The audience was captivated. Alexander noticed tears in the eyes of many, including John, who watched Sophie with pride as if she were his own granddaughter. In our Young Artisan program, Sophie continued, we learn more than just how to carve wood. We learn about our culture, about working together, about creating things that make people happy. And we want to invite all the kids who want to learn to join us. With that, Sophie gave a small bow and the crowd erupted in applause. Alexander hugged his daughter tightly, his heart bursting with pride. The rest of the ceremony passed in a blur of ribbon cutting, tours, and interviews. But for Alexander, the highlight of the day came at the very end when most of the guests had left. He found himself standing in the new Central Park of Harmony District, with Sophie by his side and John in front of them. The setting sun bathed the city in warm hues of gold and pink. You did it, Mr. Rivers, John said, his voice full of emotion. You created something beautiful here, something that will last. Alexander shook his head, smiling. No, John, we did it, all of us. You showed me the way when I was lost. You reminded me of what really matters in life. John nodded, his eyes shining. You know, when I lost my workshop in the earthquake, I thought I had lost my purpose in life. But now I see that was just the beginning of a new chapter. Thanks to you and Sophie, I've been able to pass on my knowledge to a new generation. That's a gift that has no price. Sophie, who had been quietly listening, suddenly hugged John tightly. Thank you for teaching me, Grandpa John, she said, using the affectionate title she had adopted for the old artisan. Alexander felt a lump in his throat as he watched the scene. He thought of Maria and how proud she would have been of Sophie, of the woman their daughter was becoming. He thought of the long and sometimes difficult journey that had brought him to this moment. As the sun set over Harmony District, Alexander Rivers realized that he had found something far more valuable than business success. He had found a sense of purpose, a community, and a way to honor the past while building a better future. Come on, Alexander finally said, placing a hand on John's shoulder and the other on Sophie's. We've got a lot of work ahead of us. This is just the beginning. And so, as the first stars began to appear in the New York sky, 3 generations walked together into the future, united by love, art, and the vision of a more harmonious world.